Picture this. You're reviewing security footage tied to a missing person case. You expect the usual, a quick break-in, a burst of motion, maybe a few chaotic minutes before the intruder vanishes into the dark. But that's not what happens. The timestamp keeps ticking. Not 41 seconds. Not a few minutes. 41 minutes. Someone moves through the house slowly, deliberately, not searching, not rushing, just moving, like they know exactly where they are. Like they belong. Every step feels measured. Controlled. Unhurried. Now take it a step further. This isn't just any house. It belongs to the mother of Nancy Guthrie, a woman connected to one of the most recognizable faces in American television. 70 years old. Living quietly. Reliant on daily medication to survive. And those medications? They're still sitting there. Untouched. Right on the kitchen counter. She's gone. No overturned furniture. No clear signs of a struggle. No forced entry that immediately explains anything. Just a house frozen in place, and a silence that feels heavier the longer you sit with it. Because the more investigators look, the less it makes sense. Then the ransom note appears. At first glance, it should bring clarity. A demand. A motive. A direction. But something about it doesn't sit right. The wording feels off. The tone feels forced. Experienced investigators read it, and instead of answers, it raises more questions. It feels staged. Like it was meant to be found. And then, something even more telling happens. The county sheriff makes a decision that immediately shifts the tone of the entire case. This won't be handled like a standard kidnapping. From the very beginning, homicide detectives are brought in. Not later. Not as a precaution. Immediately. That choice alone sends a quiet but undeniable message through law enforcement. Because it suggests something most people aren't ready to consider yet. This might not be a kidnapping at all. This is the Nancy Guthrie case. And those 41 minutes? They're not just unusual. They may be the key to everything. Before we go any further, take a second and tell me where you're watching from, because what comes next isn't straightforward, and it doesn't follow the rules most people expect. February, 2024. Pima County, Arizona. A quiet neighborhood where nothing ever seems out of place. The kind of area where routines matter, where neighbors recognize each other, where days pass without incident. Nancy Guthrie lived a life defined by consistency. At 70 years old, her health depended on it. Every day followed a structure, especially when it came to the medication she needed to take without fail. And then, without warning, that routine stopped. She wasn't dealing with minor health issues. Nancy depended on strict, daily medication to stay alive. Missing even a short window wasn't just risky, it could turn critical, fast. And yet, those medications were left behind. Still sitting there. Untouched. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is a familiar face to millions, co-anchoring today. But despite that public connection, Nancy lived a quiet, private life in Arizona, far removed from cameras, headlines, and attention. She kept to herself. Kept to her routine. And she was careful. Her home wasn't unprotected. It had security cameras. An alarm system. The kind of setup you'd expect from someone who didn't take chances. Which makes what happened next even harder to explain. Because one weekend morning, she vanished. Not outside. Not during an errand. But from inside her own home. While those very security systems were running. Recording. Watching. When investigators pulled the footage, they expected something quick, something chaotic. Instead, they found something far more unsettling. The timestamps didn't just show entry. They showed duration. Exactly 41 minutes. In criminal terms, that's not just unusual. It's almost unheard of. Most burglars operate on what's often called the 5-minute rule: get in, take what you can, and leave before anyone even realizes something's wrong. But this didn't follow that pattern at all. Whoever entered Nancy's home didn't rush. There was no frantic movement. No hesitation. They moved calmly. Methodically. With what investigators would later describe as an almost unnerving familiarity with the space. Like they weren't guessing. Like they already knew. And that detail changed everything. Because it raised a question investigators couldn't ignore. Was this really a break-in? Or was it something far more personal? The man leading the investigation, Chris Nanos, made a decision that immediately set this case apart from the start. He brought in homicide detectives. Not quietly. Not as a backup plan. But openly, and immediately. At a press conference that spread across the country within hours, Sheriff Nanos made it clear this wasn't standard procedure. He rarely involves homicide investigators in missing person cases. But this one was different. This one came with what he described as deeply concerning information. Then he said something that stayed with everyone watching. There is something not right here. That single statement shifted the entire tone of the investigation. Because it revealed something most people hadn't considered yet. From the very beginning, law enforcement wasn't just searching for a missing woman. They were bracing for the possibility that this case was already something else entirely. Something darker. Something irreversible. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because cases like this don't unfold the way you expect, and the smallest details often carry the most weight. And what comes next? It starts to reveal exactly why Sheriff Nanos knew, almost instantly. This wasn't random. This wasn't rushed. And this wasn't a typical kidnapping. Nancy Guthrie wasn't just any victim. Nancy Guthrie wasn't just another name in a report. She was a 70-year-old woman living a quiet life in Arizona, but she was also the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable faces in American media. Every morning, Savannah appears on millions of screens as a leading voice on Today, interviewing presidents, covering global events, and representing one of the most trusted platforms in broadcast journalism. And that connection? It changes everything. What might have stayed a local missing person case doesn't stay local for long. It expands, fast, drawing national attention, scrutiny, and pressure from every direction. Because visibility like that doesn't just bring awareness. It brings exposure. High-profile connections can attract the wrong kind of attention. For some, it's financial. Ransom becomes more tempting when there's a perception of access or wealth. For others, it turns personal, grievances, real or imagined, directed at someone constantly in the public eye. And in more unsettling cases, it becomes something else entirely. Obsession. The kind that builds quietly. The kind that convinces someone they're closer to a life they've only ever watched from a distance. Investigators had to consider all of it. Every angle. Every possibility. But then, they found something that made the situation even more unsettling. The timing. Nancy didn't disappear on a random day. It happened at a very specific moment, one that didn't feel accidental. Just hours later, Savannah was scheduled to leave the United States for an international assignment. Her destination? South Korea. She was set to cover the Winter Olympics for NBC, a major global event planned months in advance, publicly announced, and widely known. Think about that. Whoever was responsible didn't just choose a person. They may have chosen a moment. A moment when Nancy's closest immediate family member would be thousands of miles away, caught between long flights, demanding schedules, and a time difference that complicates everything. Communication slows down. Decisions get delayed. Response becomes harder. That kind of timing doesn't feel random. It feels deliberate. Measured. Like it was built around more than just access to a house. For investigators, it raised a question they couldn't ignore. Was this a crime of opportunity? Or was someone paying close enough attention to plan it down to the hour? Because if it was the latter, then this wasn't just about where Nancy was. It was about who was watching her life closely enough to know exactly when to act. And that possibility changed the stakes entirely. No forced entry. No shattered glass. No broken locks. Nothing. Which left investigators staring at a possibility far more disturbing than a break-in. Because if nothing was forced, then the simplest explanation was also the most uncomfortable one. Someone had access. Or someone was expected. In cases like this, investigators don't just look at what's damaged. They look at what isn't. And an untouched home tells its own kind of story. Doors still secure. Windows still intact. Alarm system not triggered in a way that suggested panic or violence at entry. It all pointed in one direction. This wasn't a struggle to get inside. This was movement through a space that was already open to them. And that changes the entire framework of the investigation. Because now the question isn't how did they get in? It's, why weren't they stopped? Inside the home, the surveillance footage began to answer that question in the most unsettling way possible. The system didn't show chaos. It didn't show urgency. It showed patience. A presence moving through rooms with time to spare. 41 minutes of it. Long enough to search. Long enough to observe. Long enough to do far more than a quick grab-and-go crime would ever require. In fact, it crossed a threshold investigators rarely see. Because time inside a secured home is dangerous. Every extra minute increases risk. Every unnecessary second increases exposure. So criminals don't linger unless they feel safe. Or unless they feel entitled. And that distinction matters. Because entitlement suggests familiarity. Familiarity suggests knowledge. And knowledge suggests preparation. The kind of preparation that doesn't come from guessing a layout in the dark. It comes from understanding it. From knowing where things are. Where people move. Where routines exist. And then there was Nancy herself. 70 years old. dependent on medication that regulated her survival. A person who, by all accounts, followed strict routines and predictable patterns, especially inside her own home. That kind of structure makes a space easier to navigate. But it also makes it easier to predict. Investigators started to rebuild the timeline piece by piece. When she was last seen. When activity inside the home stopped. When the cameras captured movement that no longer matched normal life. And each layer added something more unsettling than the last. Because nothing about it felt rushed. Nothing about it felt improvised. It felt rehearsed. As if the person inside already knew what they were going to find. Already knew where to go. Already knew how long they had. And that realization pulled the investigation further away from random crime. And closer to something far more intentional. At this stage, detectives began widening their focus beyond the obvious questions. They weren't just asking who would want Nancy gone. They were asking who would know her life well enough to operate inside it without resistance. Because access doesn't always mean breaking in. Sometimes it means being let in, directly or indirectly. And when they re-examined the footage with that in mind, a new detail stood out. The movements weren't just slow. They were confident. Not exploratory. Not hesitant. Confident. That single quality shifted the emotional weight of the entire case. Because confidence inside a victim's home doesn't come from luck. It comes from certainty. And certainty usually has a source. Someone who provided information. Someone who left a door open. Or someone who was already known to the space. And that brought investigators back to the most uncomfortable question of all. If there was no forced entry? And no visible struggle. Then who, exactly, was Nancy comfortable enough with to not fight back against? Because whatever happened inside that home didn't begin with violence. It began with trust. And trust, once broken, rarely leaves visible evidence. But it always leaves a trail. Somewhere. And investigators were getting closer to finding it. At that point, investigators were forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Nancy's home that morning showed no signs of forced entry, which meant one of two things. Either the person who entered had a key, or Nancy Guthrie herself let them in. That single detail narrowed the field in a way detectives immediately recognized as significant and unsettling. Because it shifted the entire case away from a random intrusion. And toward something far more intimate. Far more personal. But the situation inside the home was about to become even more troubling. Nancy's residence was equipped with a full surveillance system, interior and exterior cameras designed to cover nearly every angle of the property. On paper, it was exactly what investigators hope to see in cases like this. A digital witness. Something that never forgets. And at first glance, everything appeared normal. The exterior cameras were functioning perfectly. They captured movement outside the home. They logged timestamps. They recorded everything they were supposed to. No malfunctions. No interruptions. No warning signs. But the interior cameras? Those told a very different story. The very systems that should have documented what happened inside the home, the movements, the interactions, the identity of anyone who entered, were not recording during the critical window. Not partially offline. Not glitching intermittently. Completely inactive. For the entire 41-minute period. And that detail immediately raised alarm bells. Because it wasn't consistent with a system-wide failure. Nothing else was affected. The exterior cameras continued working without issue. Power was stable. The system itself was clearly operational. Only one part was silent. Only the part inside the house. And that kind of selective failure is what investigators notice most. Because it doesn't behave like accident. It behaves like control. Which led to a chilling fork in the investigation. Either someone deliberately disabled the interior cameras? Or they already knew those cameras wouldn't be capturing anything useful. Former homicide detective Ted Williams later reviewed the case publicly, and his assessment was direct. He pointed to the combination of prolonged presence inside the home and the precise camera failure as something that rarely happens by coincidence. In his view, it suggested foreknowledge. Planning. A level of awareness about the property that went beyond chance. Because interior surveillance systems aren't visible from the outside. You can't look at a house and understand its blind spots. You can't guess which cameras are recording and which aren't. That kind of information isn't casual knowledge. It's learned. Which brought investigators back to a question they could no longer avoid. How would someone know the internal surveillance setup well enough to exploit it so precisely? The answer, if there was one, pointed in only a few directions. Recent access. Prior presence. Or someone who had been inside that home before, when the system was active, visible, and understandable. And once that possibility entered the investigation, everything about the 41 minutes took on a new meaning. Because the footage no longer looked like an intrusion. It looked like a visit. A controlled one. With boundaries already understood. And outcomes already anticipated. At this stage, detectives began re-examining every known connection in Nancy's life, searching not just for motive, but for familiarity. Someone who would not be guessing their way through that house. Someone who wouldn't hesitate. Someone who wouldn't need time to figure things out. Because hesitation leaves evidence. Confusion creates noise. But confidence inside a victim's home. That suggests something far more specific. Knowledge. And as investigators continued piecing together the timeline, one realization began to solidify in the background of everything else. Nothing about that 41-minute window looked improvised. Every detail, entry, movement, timing, silence, suggested a sequence that had been thought through in advance. Carefully. Patiently. Deliberately. Which meant the most important question was no longer just who did it, but how long they had been preparing to do it. And the answer to that question was still waiting somewhere in the details investigators hadn't fully connected yet. But they were getting closer. Which systems were active? Which ones weren't? Which angles were covered, and which ones weren't? That kind of awareness doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from familiarity. From understanding the layout, the routines, the blind spots, details you only pick up by being inside the space long enough to learn it. And then investigators turned to something even more unsettling. The medication. Nancy Guthrie didn't just take prescriptions as a precaution, she depended on them. Daily. Consistently. Without interruption. These weren't optional. They were essential. And they weren't hidden. They sat in plain view on the kitchen counter, exactly where they would be as part of her routine. Easy to see. Impossible to overlook for anyone spending time inside the home. Which is what makes what happened next so difficult to explain. In a typical kidnapping, there's one basic principle investigators expect, even from inexperienced offenders. A living victim has value. A dead one doesn't. Ransom requires proof of life. Negotiation requires stability. The entire premise depends on keeping the victim alive long enough to matter. So even in rushed or poorly planned abductions, there's usually some effort, however minimal, to preserve the victim's condition. To maintain leverage. But here, there was nothing. Nancy's medication was left exactly where it was. No attempt to take it. No sign it was gathered. No indication anyone even considered it. Just left behind. Untouched. As if it didn't matter at all. And that detail hit investigators hard. Because it forced a question they couldn't avoid anymore. Was this ever about keeping Nancy alive? Or was something else happening inside that home, something where her long-term survival was never part of the plan? Ted Williams later reinforced what many investigators were already thinking. Spending 41 minutes inside a residence doesn't align with a rushed crime. Not burglary. Not a standard abduction. It suggests something else entirely. Familiarity. Confidence. Control. The kind of control that allows someone to move through a home without urgency. Without fear. Without hesitation. That kind of presence doesn't feel like intrusion. It feels like access. Like someone operating within a space they understand. A space that doesn't intimidate them. And when investigators began layering all of these details together, the timing aligned with travel, the interior cameras disabled, the lack of forced entry, and now the complete disregard for critical medication, a pattern started to take shape. Not chaotic. Not impulsive. Deliberate. Because each element on its own might raise suspicion. But together? They begin to reinforce each other. Each one pointing in the same direction. This wasn't rushed. It wasn't random. And it didn't look like something that spiraled out of control. It looked constructed. Step by step. Decision by decision. A pattern that doesn't resemble a typical kidnapping. But something far more calculated. Something where the outcome may have been decided long before anyone ever stepped inside that house. And if that's true, then those 41 minutes weren't about opportunity. They were about execution. Every detail was pointing in the same direction. No forced entry, that suggests access. Or permission. Disabled interior cameras, that suggests prior knowledge. Medication left behind, that suggests a very different intent. And 41 minutes inside the home? That suggests comfort. Not urgency. When investigators stepped back and looked at the full picture, the pattern wasn't subtle anymore. It was consistent. Too consistent. This wasn't random. It wasn't rushed. And it didn't resemble the behavior of a stranger moving through an unfamiliar space. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie knew that house. They understood her routines. They moved with purpose, without hesitation, without wasted motion. Like they had nothing to figure out. Like they'd already figured it out before they ever walked in. And most importantly, they knew exactly what they were doing. Then came the ransom demand. On the surface, it looked right. Contact was made. Money was requested. Instructions were given. All the elements you'd expect in a kidnapping scenario were technically there. But to experienced investigators, something felt off almost immediately. Because real ransom operations, especially those carried out by individuals who understand what they're doing, follow patterns. Clear patterns. They're controlled, structured, deliberate. Professionals don't leave things to chance. They establish communication channels that are consistent and reliable. They provide proof of life early, something undeniable, something that confirms the victim is still alive and in their control. They set deadlines that carry weight. And when those deadlines pass, there are consequences. Not chaos, pressure. Because pressure drives compliance. But none of that structure was present here. The communication didn't feel controlled. It felt uneven. Deadlines came and went, and nothing happened. No escalation. No consequence. No shift in tone that suggested urgency or leverage. Messages lacked consistency. Instructions didn't build toward anything concrete. Instead of tightening control, everything felt like it was drifting. Unfocused. Unstable. And then there was the detail investigators couldn't ignore. There was no clear proof of life. Nothing definitive. Nothing that confirmed Nancy was still alive after she was taken. In a real ransom situation, that's one of the first things established. Because without it, there's no leverage. No reason to pay. No reason to believe the situation is what it claims to be. To investigators, that absence wasn't just unusual. It was a signal. A warning. Because when a ransom demand lacks structure, lacks discipline, and most importantly, lacks leverage, it often points to a different motive entirely. One where money isn't the real objective. One where the demand itself may only exist to create the illusion of a kidnapping. To delay. To misdirect. To buy time. And if that's true, then the ransom note wasn't a negotiation. It was a performance. A carefully placed piece of the story, designed to make everything look like something it wasn't. Which means the real question investigators had to ask wasn't how much money was being demanded, but why someone would go to the effort of staging a ransom at all. Because staging requires intent. And intent always points somewhere. And in this case, it was pointing closer and closer to something investigators had been considering from the very beginning. This wasn't about taking Nancy for leverage. It may have been about making it look like she was taken at all. And that distinction changes everything. Most critically, there was never any credible proof of life. In real kidnapping cases, that isn't optional. It's essential. Investigators expect something undeniable, audio, video, or a specific detail only the victim could provide. Something that removes all doubt. Something that confirms the victim is still alive. But here, there was nothing that met that standard. And to experienced detectives, that isn't a minor mistake. It's a major warning sign. Because when proof of life is missing, it usually leads to one of two conclusions. Either the people behind it don't understand how ransom negotiations actually work. Or worse, there is no living victim to prove. That realization shifted everything. What initially looked like a kidnapping began to take on a different shape. Something less organic. Less reactive. More constructed. The communication didn't feel controlled. It felt improvised. The demands didn't feel strategic. They felt performative. As if someone was following the outline of a crime, without understanding how the real version actually works. Veteran investigators, people who had handled these cases for decades, recognized the pattern almost immediately. This wasn't negotiation. It was theater. And that distinction matters. Because real kidnappers are focused on one objective. Getting paid. Everything they do supports that goal: structure, pressure, proof, timing. But staged ransom attempts? They serve a different purpose entirely. They distract. They delay. They redirect attention away from what really happened. The ransom note wasn't leverage. It was misdirection. A layer placed over the truth. And once detectives accepted that possibility, their entire approach changed. They stopped asking, who would kidnap Nancy Guthrie? And started asking something far more direct. Far more dangerous. Who would want her gone? Because that question doesn't look outward. It looks inward. Toward relationships. Toward proximity. Toward people who knew her life well enough to move through it without resistance. While investigators continued breaking down the ransom communications, searching for inconsistencies, patterns, and anything that might point to a source, something else began to surface. Something small at first. Easy to overlook. A neighbor. Laura Gargano. She noticed something about Nancy's property that didn't sit right. At first, it didn't seem significant. Not urgent. Just out of place. But in investigations like this, it's often the smallest details that matter most. The things that don't immediately connect. The things that feel just slightly off. Because those details don't follow the script. They don't fit neatly into assumptions. And that's exactly why they matter. What Laura noticed didn't look like evidence. Not at first. But it was different. Different enough to mention. Different enough to remember. And that observation, quiet, almost incidental, was about to open an entirely new direction in the investigation. One that would pull detectives away from theory. And closer to something real. Something physical. Something that had been there the entire time. Waiting to be seen. She mentioned it casually. Just an observation during routine neighborhood canvassing. But what Laura Gargano pointed out would end up shifting everything. Nancy's roof looked different. Too clean. Too new. While neighboring homes showed the usual wear, dust, streaks from rain, the slow fading from constant sun exposure, Nancy stood out. It looked untouched. Almost out of place. And then came the detail investigators couldn't ignore. The timing. The work had been completed just days before her disappearance. That single detail opened an entirely new line of thinking. Because roof work doesn't happen quietly or in isolation. It means people were there. Contractors. Laborers. Workers who spent hours, sometimes days, on the property. People who had a legitimate reason to be there. Legitimate access. And more importantly, time. Time to observe. Time to notice things without drawing attention. They would have seen patterns without trying. When Nancy came and went. When she was alone. How her routine unfolded throughout the day. And in the process, they may have crossed a line that no one noticed. Stepping inside briefly. Using a restroom. Grabbing water. Exchanging a few words that felt insignificant in the moment. But moments like that add up. Because each small interaction reveals something. The layout of the home. The placement of furniture. The positioning of cameras. Which systems are visible. And which ones aren't. That kind of exposure is easy to overlook. When workers are present for days at a time, they blend in. They become part of the background. Trusted by default. Rarely questioned. Eventually, barely noticed at all. But from the other side? They're paying attention. Even when it doesn't seem like they are. They see routines. They recognize patterns. They notice details that don't feel important. Until they are. For investigators, this wasn't just another lead. It was a shift in perspective. Because now, the focus expanded. It wasn't just about personal relationships anymore. It was about proximity. Physical proximity. People who had been inside Nancy's space. People who had seen things others hadn't. And the timing made it impossible to ignore. Days before she vanished. Not weeks. Not months. Days. That overlap, between access and disappearance, was too tight to dismiss as coincidence. So detectives moved quickly. They began identifying everyone connected to the roof work. Tracking them down. Interviewing them. Building timelines. Comparing statements. Every contractor. Every laborer. Every individual who had stepped onto that property during that narrow window. Because somewhere in that group, there was a possibility. Not certainty. But possibility. Someone who didn't just see a job site. But saw an opportunity. Someone who understood the layout. Recognized the vulnerabilities. And realized exactly how those details could be used. Because by this point, investigators weren't just looking for someone with a motive. They were looking for someone with knowledge. Someone who could turn familiarity into access. And access into control. And if that person existed within that group, then the answer to what happened inside those 41 minutes might have been standing on that roof just days earlier. Watching. Learning. Waiting. From there, the investigation intensified. Background checks expanded. Every name connected to the property was pulled into focus. Detectives built timelines, cross-checked alibis, and started mapping movement, who had been there, how long they stayed, and what access they might have had. Nothing was assumed. Everything was verified. The contractor responsible for the roof work quickly became a central point of interest. Not because of direct evidence, but because of proximity. Because of access. Because of timing. Investigators sat him down and went through everything in detail. Who was on the crew? How many workers rotated through the job? How many days were they present? Did anyone come and go outside of scheduled hours? And then the deeper questions. Did any of them have criminal histories? Financial pressure? Anything that could create motive, or make someone vulnerable to acting on opportunity? But the scope didn't stop there. Because once the investigation shifted toward familiarity, the net widened. Anyone with repeated access to Nancy's home had to be considered. Delivery drivers who came by regularly. Service providers who maintained the property. People who had been in and out often enough to stop noticing the space. But remember it subconsciously. And that's where things became more complicated. the list didn't shrink. It grew. Dozens of individuals now fit at least part of the profile. People who had both access and opportunity. People who could have learned the layout, the routines, the vulnerabilities, enough to move through the house for 41 minutes without hesitation. Narrowing that list wasn't quick. It couldn't be. It required patience. Careful interviews. Revisiting the same answers multiple times. Comparing statements side by side. Looking for anything that didn't quite line up. Because in cases like this, the truth rarely shows itself all at once. It reveals itself in fragments. In small contradictions. In details that shift ever so slightly when repeated. And through all of it, one observation kept resurfacing. The roof. What Laura Gargano had noticed wasn't just a passing comment anymore. It had become a thread. A consistent point investigators kept returning to. Because sometimes, it isn't the obvious evidence that breaks a case open. It's the quiet detail. The one that doesn't demand attention. But holds it once you look closer. A clean roof in a neighborhood of weathered ones. Wasn't just visual contrast. It was a timestamp. A marker. It placed specific individuals at Nancy's home in the exact window investigators were now scrutinizing most closely. Days before she disappeared. And that timing mattered. Because it aligned too closely with everything else. The access. The familiarity. The precision. If this was planned, then planning didn't start the morning she vanished. It started earlier. While people were already on that property. Moving freely. Observing without suspicion. Learning without being noticed. And that realization added weight to every detail investigators had uncovered so far. Because it suggested something far more deliberate than a sudden act. It suggested preparation. As the case began drawing national attention, Chris Nano stepped forward to address the public directly. The press conference that followed didn't just provide updates. It reframed the entire case. Because what he said next, and how he said it, would shape how everyone understood what was really unfolding behind the scenes. He stood in front of a wall of cameras, local reporters, national outlets, microphones stacked tightly in front of him. At the center of it all was Chris Nanos. And what he said confirmed what many experienced investigators had already begun to suspect, but hadn't yet said out loud. In Pima County, Arizona, he explained, missing person reports are not unusual. They happen constantly. Search and rescue teams are deployed for lost hikers who misjudge the terrain. Elderly individuals with cognitive decline wander away and need to be located quickly. People leave care facilities, get disoriented, or simply fail to return home when expected. There is an entire system built for it. Structured. Efficient. Routine. Search grids are mapped out. Teams are coordinated. Families are updated as efforts unfold. It is, in most cases, predictable work. But then he made the distinction clear. Cases like this? They are not routine. Sheriff Nanos emphasized that it is extremely rare, almost unheard of, for homicide detectives to be brought into a missing person case at the very beginning. That kind of decision is not procedural. It is not casual. It is not based on speculation. It happens only when something in the earliest available information doesn't align with a standard disappearance. Something that suggests this is not confusion. Not accident. Not medical distress. It suggests something else entirely. Criminal intent. Serious criminal intent. Because homicide investigators are not called in on hope. They are called in when there is reason to believe the situation may already be beyond recovery. Beyond rescue. Beyond time. And in the case of Nancy Guthrie, that decision wasn't delayed. It wasn't debated for days. It wasn't escalated through layers of review. It was made immediately. From the very first briefing, before the public had any real understanding of what was unfolding, investigators were already being pulled into a different kind of response. One designed not just to locate a missing woman, but to investigate the possibility of a homicide in progress. Sheriff Nanos told reporters there were details he could not fully disclose. Information that shaped the direction of the investigation from day one. Details serious enough that revealing them publicly could compromise the case, or alert whoever was responsible. But his decision was already made. Experienced investigators were assigned immediately. Not as backup. Not as reinforcement. But as a core part of the response. And that choice carried weight. Because it meant that behind the scenes, before any public narrative formed, law enforcement was already operating under a much darker assumption. That this was not a disappearance waiting to be solved. It was a crime already in motion. And then Sheriff Nano said something that stayed with everyone in the room long after the cameras stopped recording. A statement that didn't just summarize the case, but revealed exactly why it never looked like a typical missing person investigation from the start. And what he said next made one thing unmistakably clear. This was never going to be simple. He looked directly at the assembled media and delivered the line that cut through everything. "There is something that is not right here." Those words carried weight because they didn't come from speculation. They came from Chris Nanos, a veteran law enforcement leader in Pima County, Arizona, who had seen enough cases to recognize when a pattern breaks from the norm. Not every disappearance is the same. Not every missing person case follows a predictable arc. And this one wasn't behaving like any of them. That single statement sent a message louder than anything else said that day. This wasn't being treated like a standard kidnapping. It wasn't a case built around negotiation, delay, or hopeful recovery. It was being treated as something far more serious. Something potentially staged. A situation where the surface narrative, a ransom demand, a disappearance, a set of instructions, might have been constructed to mask what actually happened inside that home. Because from an investigative standpoint, nothing was aligning cleanly. The timing. The behavior inside the residence. The absence of proof of life. The extended 41-minute presence captured on footage. Each detail, on its own, raised concern. Together, they formed something investigators couldn't dismiss. A pattern. And that pattern pointed in one direction. A narrative being built not to reflect the truth, but to redirect attention away from it. While search and rescue operations continued in the field, covering terrain, following leads, and working under the possibility that Nancy Guthrie might still be alive, the investigative side of the case had already begun shifting its center of gravity. Hope still existed in the field. But certainty had changed shape behind the scenes. Search teams operated with urgency, because that is what rescue demands. But detectives were no longer working only toward recovery. They were building a case. Statements were being documented with precision, not just for their content, but for their durability. What could be verified later? What could be challenged? What might break under scrutiny? Potential suspects were interviewed with dual purpose. To gather information, yes, but also to lock in timelines. To establish fixed points that could be compared against other accounts. To create a structure that could hold under pressure if contradictions emerged later. Because in serious investigations, nothing is casual. Every detail becomes data. Every answer becomes evidence. Every inconsistency becomes something to return to. And while that process unfolded behind the scenes, Chris Nanos remained carefully measured in what he shared publicly. Not everything could be disclosed. Not because it lacked importance. But because revealing it too early risked something far more critical. Compromising the direction of the investigation itself. And as the press conference ended and cameras shut off, one thing lingered in the space he left behind. The sense that investigators were no longer reacting to a disappearance. They were working inside something already in motion. And what came next would determine whether that motion led to answers. Or something far more final. Strategy, and basic decency toward the family meant he couldn't disclose everything investigators were seeing in real time. But even with those limits, the message was still unmistakable. By choosing to publicly bring in homicide detectives early, and by stating so clearly that something wasn't right, Chris Nanos effectively signaled to the public and the media that this was not a standard missing person case in Pima County, Arizona. It was being treated as something far more serious from the very beginning. And once that realization began to spread, the narrative around Nancy Guthrie's disappearance started to shift beyond the walls of law enforcement. National attention followed. And with it, interpretation changed. What initially looked like a possible kidnapping began to resemble something more deliberate, more structured, more controlled. Not a random abduction, but a scenario where the surface story, ransom demands, communication, urgency, might have been constructed to conceal something underneath it entirely. Law enforcement was no longer simply reacting. They were operating under the growing assumption that someone within Nancy Guthrie's orbit could be responsible. Someone with proximity. Someone with knowledge. Someone with access to the rhythms of her life. From that point forward, the investigation began to branch into multiple focus theories, each grounded in fragments of evidence that didn't fully resolve on their own, but formed clearer patterns when viewed together. The first theory centered on contractor involvement or opportunistic access. Someone with legitimate reason to be on the property. Someone who could move in and out without raising suspicion. Someone who might have spent enough time inside the home to understand far more than a casual visitor ever should. The roof work stood out again. It had been completed just days before the disappearance. And it placed multiple workers directly in Nancy's environment for extended periods, on ladders, on the roofline, around the perimeter of the home. Observing. Absorbing. Learning without intending to look like they were learning. Because in cases like this, familiarity doesn't always come from relationships or closeness. Sometimes it comes from repetition. From presence. From simply being there long enough for patterns to reveal themselves. And that possibility, of someone blending into the background of legitimate work while quietly gathering critical information, quickly became one of the strongest early investigative directions. Not because it was certain, but because it fit too many of the inconsistencies investigators had already identified. And as that theory gained traction, it began to overlap with something even more unsettling. The growing sense that whoever was responsible didn't just act on opportunity. They acted on understanding. Unreachable. And that uncertainty forced investigators to do something uncomfortable, but necessary. They had to stop thinking in terms of what made sense, and start thinking in terms of what could be proven. As each theory expanded, detectives began tightening the one thing that could actually break them open: structure. Timelines were rebuilt down to the minute. Phone records were re-examined for anomalies that had initially seemed irrelevant. Digital activity, routine, background, almost invisible, was resequenced to see if anything shifted under closer scrutiny. Because in complex cases, narratives can mislead. But time rarely lies. The contractor theory remained active, but investigators began narrowing not just who had access, but who had unaccounted for time during critical windows. The staged kidnapping theory also remained on the table, but it required a level of coordination that meant more than one weak point would eventually appear. Someone would slip, contradict themselves, or leave a trace in the logistical planning. And the third theory, connected to public exposure, was treated with caution, not because it was implausible, but because it expanded the suspect pool beyond anything easily containable. Especially when considering someone like Savannah Guthrie. Her visibility didn't just attract attention, it complicated every possible motive connected to her family. It meant investigators had to separate emotional noise from actionable evidence. And that distinction became critical. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, detectives kept returning to the same central contradiction. Multiple theories explained how someone could have accessed Nancy Guthrie. But none fully explained why the sequence of events unfolded the way it did. Not the timing. Not the restraint of certain actions. Not the way the scene seemed both controlled and improvised at the same time. And so the investigation entered its most difficult phase. Not the search for suspects, but the search for convergence. The point where all competing theories would collapse into a single, coherent explanation. Because in cases like this, the truth rarely announces itself through one perfect clue. It emerges when everything else stops fitting. And somewhere inside that growing list of mismatched pieces, was the one detail investigators had not yet fully understood, but were now closing in on with every passing hour. And as that hope persisted, investigators quietly shifted their focus toward the one factor that no theory could ignore: control. Because whether the scenario involved opportunistic access, staged deception, or targeted intent, one thing kept repeating across every working hypothesis. Someone had control inside Nancy Guthrie's environment for a sustained period of time. Control over movement. Control over timing. Control over what was left untouched, and what was deliberately disturbed. That's what the 41-minute window began to represent. Not just presence, but direction. Investigators started reconstructing that interval with increasing precision, breaking it down into behavioral segments rather than treating it as a single continuous block of time. What would someone do in the first 5 minutes? What changes in urgency after 10? At what point does hesitation become confidence? And more importantly, at what point does uncertainty disappear entirely? Because the way someone moves through a space they don't belong in often reveals more than what they take or leave behind. It reveals whether they are guessing or remembering. That distinction forced detectives to revisit one uncomfortable implication across all theories. Familiarity may not have been incidental. It may have been earned. Whether through legitimate access, like contractors or service providers, or through prior, unnoticed exposure. The behavior suggested a level of environmental confidence that investigators couldn't easily attribute to a one-time intrusion. And as that realization settled in, the investigation began tightening around a narrower set of possibilities. Not just who could have entered the home, but who would have felt at ease once inside it. Meanwhile, the public-facing narrative remained carefully controlled. Law enforcement continued to withhold critical details, balancing transparency with the need to preserve evidentiary integrity. But behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. Because every hour without resolution didn't just extend uncertainty. It narrowed the window in which answers could still be found intact. And for Nancy Guthrie's family, that waiting period became its own form of reality. A suspended state between information and silence. Between hope and fear. Between what was still possible, and what was beginning to feel irreversible. Still, investigators pushed forward. Not because they had clarity, but because they were running out of room for ambiguity. And somewhere in the overlap between access, timing, and behavior, They believed the truth was finally beginning to take shape. And that tension, between what the family needed and what investigators could safely provide, became one of the defining pressures of the entire case. Because every passing day without answers didn't just extend uncertainty, it widened the emotional gap between two realities that were moving at different speeds. On one side, Nancy Guthrie's family continued to push for visibility, urgency, and resolution, driven by the instinct that time mattered in a way that couldn't be measured in reports or filings. On the other side, investigators remained bound to a slower, more constrained process, one governed not by urgency, but by admissibility. What could be proven? What could be corroborated? What could survive scrutiny in court? And that difference shaped everything. Statements were reviewed not just for meaning, but for legal durability. Leads were pursued not just for possibility, but for evidentiary value. Even promising directions had to be weighed against the risk of contaminating the broader case structure. Meanwhile, public attention, amplified by the presence of Savannah Guthrie, meant that silence itself became part of the narrative. Every pause was interpreted. Every delay was analyzed. Every absence of detail was filled in by speculation. But inside the investigative team, speculation had no standing. Only patterns did. Only verified connections mattered. Only what could be reconstructed consistently across multiple independent sources could move forward. And so the work continued in a quieter register. Rebuilding timelines. Reevaluating witness statements. Rechecking prior assumptions against newly emerging inconsistencies. Because in complex cases, progress often doesn't look like breakthroughs. It looks like subtraction. Eliminating what doesn't fit. Discarding what cannot be proven. Slowly narrowing the field until only a small number of explanations remain viable. And in this case, that narrowing process was beginning to converge on something investigators couldn't yet fully articulate publicly, but could no longer ignore internally. A shift was happening. From broad theory building, to focused confirmation. From what might have happened, to what most likely did. And as that shift took hold, one reality became increasingly clear to everyone involved. The truth was not going to arrive in a single moment. It was going to emerge piece by piece, as the investigation finally caught up to the event it was trying to reconstruct. And somewhere within that reconstruction, among the timelines, the access points, and the behavioral patterns, was the sequence that would eventually explain everything. That question, how long the event had been in motion before the first known point of entry, became one of the most important threads in the entire forensic review. Because once investigators began treating the 41-minute window not as a single block of time, but as a sequence of decisions, the analysis changed shape. They started dividing it into phases. Entry, movement, search or interaction, final exit behavior. Each segment was examined for what it implied about preparation versus improvisation. Entry patterns, in particular, drew attention. A person acting without familiarity typically hesitates at thresholds, doorways, hallways, transitions between rooms. They pause. They reassess. They rely on trial and error. But in reconstructed scenarios where movement appears uninterrupted, investigators begin to consider a different explanation. Prior knowledge of the environment. That doesn't require long-term residence. It doesn't require repeated illegal access. It can come from brief but meaningful exposure, enough time to internalize layout, routines, and weak points. And that's why earlier investigative focus on legitimate site access, contractors, service visits, maintenance work, continued to carry weight. At the same time, forensic teams also examined what didn't happen during that window. Certain expected signs of chaos were absent. Certain indicators of struggle were either minimal or inconsistent with a rapidly evolving confrontation. And that absence, just as much as any presence, became part of the analysis. Because in forensic reconstruction, silence in the evidence is still information. An undisturbed object. A missing disturbance pattern. A lack of disruption in areas that would typically show reaction. Each of those details contributed to a growing conclusion inside the investigative team. This did not resemble a purely impulsive event. It resembled something structured enough to leave a trace of intent behind it. But even as that interpretation strengthened, investigators remained careful not to overreach. Because every inference had to survive scrutiny. Every theory had to align with verifiable data. And every conclusion had to be defensible in a courtroom, not just compelling in a narrative. So instead of locking onto a single explanation, they continued refining the boundaries of what the 41-minute window could logically support. What it could rule out. What it could narrow down. And what it might eventually point toward once more data became available. And through that process, one idea began to solidify, not as certainty, but as a working constraint. Whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home did not behave like someone discovering a situation in real time. They behaved like someone executing steps within a known environment. And that distinction changed the direction of the investigation once again. Because if the environment was known, then the question was no longer just about opportunity. It was about prior connection. And that brought investigators back, again, to the same narrowing circle of individuals who had been inside that space before. Legitimately, or otherwise. And that idea, belonging became a quiet but powerful lens through which investigators began re-evaluating everything they thought they knew. Because once you frame behavior as authorized, even informally or falsely, the entire profile of the offender shifts. It's no longer just about intrusion. It becomes about perceived legitimacy. That perception can come from several sources. A prior visit that felt routine at the time. Repeated presence in a professional capacity. Or even something more subtle, secondhand knowledge gained from observation, conversation, or proximity to people who had direct access. Investigators were careful here, because comfort alone cannot convict anyone. But in behavioral reconstruction, it can significantly narrow the field of plausible suspects. Because unfamiliar intruders behave differently in measurable ways. They hesitate longer at transitions. They leave more navigational errors. They generate more environmental disruption simply by not knowing what normal looks like inside the space. In contrast, the behavior suggested in this case, based on the duration and inferred activity patterns, pointed toward reduced friction in movement. And reduced friction, in turn, points toward reduced uncertainty. That is why the 41-minute window continued to carry so much weight. Not because it was long in isolation, but because it was long without visible confusion. And that combination, time plus apparent certainty, forced investigators to revisit earlier assumptions about opportunity windows. It was no longer enough to ask who could have accessed the property. They had to ask who could have done so without hesitation. At the same time, forensic analysts began mapping the implications of structured time use inside the home. If the window was divided into phases, then each phase implied a decision point. Where to go next, what to prioritize, what to ignore. And those decisions, in aggregate, begin to form a behavioral fingerprint. Not a physical trace, but a pattern of intent expressed through movement. And as that fingerprint became clearer in the reconstruction, one conclusion began to emerge within the investigative team, not as a final answer, but as a narrowing boundary. The individual inside the residence was likely operating with pre-existing knowledge or strong situational familiarity. That didn't immediately identify a suspect. But it did constrain the universe of possibilities. And in complex cases, constraint is often the first step toward resolution. Because once you eliminate randomness as the primary explanation, you are left with a smaller set of conditions that must be satisfied. Access that makes sense. Timing that aligns. Behavior that remains consistent under scrutiny. And every additional layer of analysis pushed the investigation closer to that intersection point, where opportunity, familiarity, and intent would need to overlap in a single coherent profile. But even as that convergence began to take shape, investigators remained cautious. Because behavioral inference can guide an investigation, but only physical evidence can close it. And until those two streams aligned perfectly, the case remained open. Still unresolved. Still active. And still searching for the one detail that would turn reconstruction into proof. And that distinction, between what can be suspected and what can be proven, became the defining constraint shaping every step of the investigation moving forward. Because once a case reaches this level of behavioral clarity but evidentiary incompleteness, it enters a very specific investigative phase, consolidation. This is where detectives stop expanding outward and begin pulling everything inward. Every timeline point is rechecked against physical data. Every witness statement is re-evaluated for consistency under new interpretations. Every prior assumption is tested against the strongest competing explanation. The goal is no longer to explore possibilities. It is to eliminate contradictions. And in Nancy Guthrie's case, that meant returning again and again to the same structural anchor. The 41-minute window. Not as a standalone indicator, but as a framework around which all other evidence had to fit. Investigators began asking a different kind of question. Not just, who could have done this, but, who remains consistent across every verified constraint. Access had to be plausible. Timing had to align with known absences. Behavioral patterns had to match the lack of panic inferred from scene reconstruction. And any suspect theory had to survive all three conditions simultaneously. That is where many early hypotheses began to weaken. Not because they were impossible in isolation, but because they could not satisfy all constraints at once. Meanwhile, forensic review continued to refine the meaning of familiarity in a measurable sense. Not emotional familiarity. Not assumed familiarity. But operational familiarity. The kind that allows someone to move through a space without cognitive hesitation. And as analysts layered behavioral reconstruction with environmental data, they continued to see the same emerging pattern. Reduced friction inside the residence, sustained over a continuous block of time, without indicators of disorientation or forced adaptation. That pattern did not identify a person. But it did define a profile boundary. And within that boundary, the suspect pool narrowed, incrementally, but meaningfully. Still, investigators remained disciplined. Because every inference had to remain subordinate to verifiable fact. Behavioral reconstruction could guide direction. But it could not replace evidence. And until physical corroboration aligned with the emerging profile, no theory could advance beyond internal working status. Publicly, the case remained unchanged. No arrests. No confirmed suspect. No resolution. But internally, the structure of the investigation had shifted. What began as a search for answers had become a process of convergence. A gradual tightening of possibilities toward a point where only one explanation could remain standing under full evidentiary scrutiny. And as that process continued, investigators knew something critical. They were no longer searching in the dark. They were closing in on a shape the evidence was slowly beginning to define. Theories exist because evidence allows them to exist. Investigators don't deal in speculation, they deal in patterns supported by facts that can be verified, tested, and ultimately presented in court. And in this case, those patterns are becoming increasingly defined. What law enforcement appears to be building is a developing picture. A timeline that does not align neatly with randomness. A behavioral profile that suggests possible familiarity. A sequence of events that may indicate planning rather than panic. But what they do not yet have publicly is the final piece that transforms interpretation into accountability. The kind of evidence that survives cross-examination. The kind that convinces a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The kind that leads to charges. So the investigation continues in that critical middle space where many complex cases remain for extended periods. Beyond confusion, but not yet at resolution. Building. Verifying. Waiting for the breakthrough that turns inference into proof. Sheriff Nanos, by all indications, is operating with more information than can be shared publicly. The homicide team working alongside him is likely following an internal framework of the case that the public cannot see, built from forensic results, interviews, digital records, and evidentiary connections that only gain meaning when assembled together. Somewhere within that collection of material may lie the answer. But an answer alone is not enough. It has to be proven. And that is what defines the hardest cases in criminal investigation. Not the absence of theories, but the gap between what is believed and what can be legally established. Justice does not move on suspicion. It moves on admissible fact. And those facts often take time to fully surface. Meanwhile, the human reality continues outside the investigation room. A family remains in uncertainty. A community remains unsettled. And the public watches a case that refuses to resolve quickly or neatly. Because at the center of it all remains one undeniable reality. Someone spent a critical window of time inside Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning she disappeared, and investigators are working to determine exactly what occurred during that period. Whether that truth will ultimately be revealed in a courtroom remains the central question. Not only what happened, but whether justice will be able to fully reach it. And until that moment arrives, investigators continue what they always do in cases like this. They wait for the missing link. They refine the theory. They follow every thread that could lead to confirmation. Because in the end, every unresolved case carries the same weight. Not what is assumed, but what can be proven. If you want to follow cases like this, where answers emerge slowly and evidence builds piece by piece, stay tuned for updates. Because in investigations like this, breakthroughs rarely announce themselves. They surface quietly. And when they do, everything changes.